So I've been an atheist for most of my adult life, but I find myself spiraling back into Christianity, but this time with a completely different understanding of what that means. In fact, I think this new way of looking at Christianity could help a lot of people embrace the religion and find strength and connection to God. But let's back up a bit. I grew up Christian. My dad's family, the Greek side especially, was very religious. And I went to a Bible program, a Bible study program every week, which I think actually my mom was pushing me into. And occasionally I'd go on, to Sunday service with one of my childhood friends at his church, and even to a overnight camp a couple years, a Christian summer camp. And one night at that, around a campfire, a late night campfire session, I was invited to surrender to Jesus, essentially. I invited him into my heart, and I had this euphoric experience that I carried with me for years. So I felt like I was saved and I was Christian all the way up to about high school. And somewhere in high school is where things started to get a little murky. I learned more about the intricacies of Christianity and other religions, and I read books like The God Delusion by Dawkins, and I was experimenting with psychedelics and meditation. I essentially abandoned Christianity and saw it as some kind of archaic thing that wouldn't serve me in life. I started to see it as a superstition that was actually trapping people into an outdated worldview. I carried on in life. I took sort of a radical left turn right after college into a life of activism. And, I always loved nature the whole time and feeling spiritually connected to plants and animals and people and all that. But I didn't practice any religion, and I didn't really believe in God. And, in fact, my worldview was essentially shaped by science, which I would suggest is actually the main cultural zeitgeist of our society that we live in. And theoretically, science is great. It's a totally reasonable approach to the world, to attempt to gain understanding through observation, experimentation, etc. The problem is that while science is a useful approach to learning about our world, as everything else in this day and age, it's corruptible. So the science itself can be twisted and manipulated. But we've been raised to believe that, science is the best answer that we have currently. And it's figured out so much, and you don't really need to question the fundamental paradigms of science. You just need to, as we hear, trust the science. So without talking to you for several hours about everything I've learned on this journey of seeking truth, suffice to say that I started to get signals from certain people in my sphere of influence that certain scientific paradigms that were basically sold to me as set in stone, we know this for fact, they were not actually so. And it turns out upon investigation, science itself is compromised. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can look at quotes from somebody like Marcia Angel, or Angle, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, but it is simply no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research that is published, or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. I take no measure in this conclusion, which I reached slowly and reluctantly over my 2 decades as editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. So she said that in 2009. In 2015, Richard Horton, who was the editor of another medical journal called The Lancet, he said, "The case against science is straightforward. Much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue, afflicted by studies with small sample sizes, tiny effects, invalid exploratory analysis, and flagrant conflicts of interest, together with an obsession for pursuing fashionable trends of dubious importance, science has taken a turn towards darkness." So these are editors of prestigious medical journals telling you that you can't trust the science. And yet, here we are, 10 years later. Most people still trust science, have no idea that, science needs to be heavily scrutinized and questioned and basically assumed to be crooked. And it's also important to understand that it's not just about profit. Of course, everything in this world is on some level run through money. Money talks, follow the money, all that's true. But it's not the entire picture. There are other agendas at play. Eugenics, depopulation, control, keeping people dazed and confused and dependent so they're easier to control. And even going so far as, the elites being satanic, essentially flipping the world on its head and promoting evil, almost like an inversion of God, almost to spite God. So there's all these things going on. It's not just a profit over people thing. It's beyond profit. And in fact, when you really look at all of the ways you've been lied to, when you start to go down these rabbit holes, you see that in many ways, there's a pattern to these lies, and they create a cosmology, almost like a new religion. And it's a new understanding of our place in the world and what we're doing here that takes religion out of the equation. In fact, I think the whole point of this scientific paradigm that has been pushed on us for generations is essentially tricking us into believing there is no God at all, that we are not children of God, that we're just here by chance, random mutations and atoms bumping around, and we're flying through this endless void. Our lives are basically meaningless. This is the idea that science has given us. And maybe our society is a reflection of being disconnected from God and from what's good and true. So this is kind of where I believe you end up. If you are a true seeker and you keep digging and digging, you will end up learning that we live in a world of deceptions, which operate primarily through a manufactured cosmology based on false scientific paradigms. Now, here's the wrinkle, okay? Just because science is corrupt and hiding God doesn't mean that Jesus, for example, was a real person and that he was sacrificed and that he rose again, or that Noah built an ark, or that Moses was talking to a burning. Just because science has created a false paradigm doesn't mean that everything in the Bible should be taken literally. And that's what personally made me hesitant to embrace Christianity until very recently. And it's because even though I started to recognize that, hey, we are created, there is a God, there's a creator to this realm that we live in, it became, I wasn't ready to embrace the whole Jesus story. And that is until I discovered that there is another way to look at Christianity. And that is to look at it mythologically or mystically. So in every church around us, it's basically being taught as literal. These are literal stories that historically happened, and all these other meanings that can be found in the text are ignored or shunned even. And the truth is, the people who wrote the Bible and early Christians, it's very probable that they meant for the whole thing to be interpreted metaphorically, and in fact layered things into it that were even beyond metaphors for how to live our life. But there is encoded into the Bible astro-theological concepts and even anatomical relation. I mean, there's so much. Okay, so astrotheologically, it's a big word. It basically means that what's happening in the cosmos, in the actual constellations and the zodiac and the way the sun travels through the sky across the year, all these different things, they are reflected in the stories themselves. In fact, it's not just that there are these astrological meanings in the scriptures, but also mathematical encoded meaning through what's called gematria or gematria, which is basically a numerical code where letters are certain numbers and there's this language and there's these patterns. I mean, it sounds nuts until somebody explains it and shows it to you, and then it's obvious that it's there. And in fact, there are even biological layers to this, the human anatomy. For example, the burning bush is said to be symbolic of a specific part of our brain. So, it's these stories are often meant to be our own internal alchemical process of like connecting back to our divinity. So I'm not going to get into all these details right now because that's getting into the weeds. So we're talking about the big picture here. Now, the funny thing is I was actually introduced to this concept in 2011, so long time ago, before like a decade of activism. And it was through the film called the Zeitgeist movie. One of the big concepts of that movie is this idea that Jesus being born on the 25th of December of a virgin, and these kinds of details are the same. It's the same stories that other gods, Egyptian, there's stories from Egypt and pagan religions, and there's this idea of like, why are they always born on the 25th? Why are they born of a virgin? These ideas, like why the similarities? And at the time I was like, you know what, this just means Christianity is just a mix of all these other cultures. So it's because these stories are all describing the sun as it travels through the sky over the year. The 21st of December is the winter solstice. It's the shortest day of the year, the longest night. So the sun, for those of us in the northern hemisphere, are seeing the sun get lower and lower and lower and lower up to the 21st of December. Then for 3 days, it appears to not move from that point, and then it begins rising on the 25th. Rising again, and then comes longer days, spring, all the rest. And by the way, on that time of the year, there's something that happens with like the Virgo constellation. Like you see that first, and then the sun comes up. So it's basically like the sun is being born from the constellation Virgo. Now, when I first heard all these ideas, I was like, oh my gosh. So Christianity is basically just borrowed and stolen from these other religions, and it's, of course it's bogus, right? And it's just describing the sun in the sky, so who cares, really? And, I also was like, man, how do people know about this and still believe all this stuff? It's like almost like being willfully ignorant. But here's the thing. It's actually, you can look at it another way. It could mean that Christianity is just another mythology that isn't meant to trap us, but it's meant to help us understand this world that we're living in, the sky map, and how time works in the sky across the year and even longer. And, all of it is meant to be taken with these layers that are meant to be taken not literally, but symbolically and metaphorically, and basically just layered with all this meaning that helps you live your life and understand what's going on here. And when you start to listen to someone who knows how to read these symbols, who can show you the scripture and the way it relates to the stars above, it all starts to make sense, and you can't deny that these layers are here. And oh my gosh, what does that mean? It means that we can use Christianity, embrace it, become Christians in a mystical way where you don't have to necessarily believe these miracles literally, historically occurred. That there was a virgin birth and Jesus rose again, all these things. Like, that's not the point of the religion. And I can be Christian without having to believe that stuff. And the beauty of it, and all of this is what I'm learning from my pastor of this church that I'm a part of now, which, by the way, his name is Marty Leeds, and the church is called the Gnostic Academy. The Gnostic Academy on YouTube, you can find it. They have sermons on Sundays. he argues that Christianity is actually like the most resourceful religion of our time. And it has to do with, even though we can appreciate and learn from all the great religious traditions, and we can see the similarities because, they're all encoded with what's happening in our sky and all these other things that, the patterns in nature. But the cool thing about Christianity is Jesus, he called out the evil in his society. Again, whether it's literally historically happened or whether this is a mythological character like Luke Skywalker or, King Arthur, it doesn't matter. The point is that we're supposed to connect with this Christ consciousness inside of ourselves. And so we become the person who's meant to call out the Pharisees of our time and flip over the tables of the moneylenders in our own way, in our time. And that explains, by the way, why out of all the religions in the world, Christianity is attacked the most. Because essentially, we're in a spiritual war. I understand this now. I've been hearing that for years, but I haven't fully understood that until now. And Jesus, again, whether a real human person or a mythological archetype that we are meant to activate within ourselves, Jesus is a danger to those who wage war on God and promote evil. Jesus is their enemy. And us calling upon Jesus and connecting to God, it's too empowering. It becomes dangerous for them. It threatens the elite's control over us. And let me tell you, when you have this connection to God that is within yourself, a direct connection to your own Christ consciousness, your anxiety melts away. You can trust that I too am a child of God, and I simply need to do the work that's put out in front of me to the best of my ability. Trust that everyone else is also a child of God, and if they connect their own Christ consciousness and we're all operating from that, we can do what needs to be done. We can do what is good works in this life, and we can fight back against the evil that has outgrown our society. That the balance is tipped way too far in that direction. And ultimately, you can have confidence that, you can recognize, yes, we have limitations. I can't change the entire world, but we can change our world. We can connect and do God's work in our own communities. We can be the hero who is operating as a servant to God, a protector of what is good and true. And that's why I'm beginning to embrace this symbolic, mystical view of Christianity and becoming very comfortable calling myself a Christian and finding the strength in that. And I'm going to be sharing so much more about this as I learn from, again, the Gnostic Academy and just continuing along this path. And I will be sharing here what I learned. If you are feeling like you're resonating to some of this, I have some suggestions in terms of how you too can start to explore Christianity in this new way. On a very practical level, you can simply go to the Sunday sermons at the Gnostic Academy on YouTube. You also need to be regularly connecting to the deepest part of your heart and soul, whether that be through singing or walking through the forest or yoga. It doesn't matter. Prayer, meditation, even creativity itself is an art. It's divine, You need to be nourishing that soul and connecting to your internal divinity, which, by the way, will help you develop an inner resilience, which you're going to need, because this way of looking at Christianity is actually attacked. And, coming to the truth on any of the hidden truths, recognizing and calling out the deceptions is going to require you to veer off the mainstream path and that requires a level of strength and composure that is developed through time and practice and effort. And you're gonna need to withstand ridicule and attacks from even people in your own life. You need to be willing to step out on your own and be a leader, just like Jesus was. You also, of course, and very importantly, because we have these ideas of what the Bible means, and you need to open up to the idea that it has within it encoded hidden truths, and that you can seek these out and start to understand these things with help from people like Marty Leeds and others, and finding what is true to you. So there's a lot more to say, but we'll cut it here for now. I suspect that many of you genuine truth seekers are going to resonate with what I'm describing in this video. You're going to be able to finally embrace our heritage of Christianity. And it's a great feeling. There's something deeply grounding in it. There's a deep strength. And together we can stand with that connection to God and become the heroic spiritual warriors that we are capable of being and that this world desperately needs. I'll see you in church.